The story of Rhodesia begins with Cecil Rhodes, who we are not going to talk about. Now, you could make entire videos just about this guy, but if I have to hear one more conspiratorial rant about the Rhodes Foundation, Council on Foreign Relations, or the Trilateral Commission, I am gonna lose my goddamn mind. So here's the short version. Cecil Rhodes was a British tycoon in the late 19th century who made a fortune from mining in British colonies in southern Africa. And similar to other tycoons of the era such as Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and John D. Rockefeller, he would go on to donate tons of money to various educational and philanthropic ventures, which is why there are so many conspiracy theories about all of them. Rhodes was also an ardent advocate of British imperialism, serving as the governor of the Cape Colony in the 1890s. At this time, he was also in charge of the British South Africa Company, which was chartered in 1889. Just 4 years after the Berlin Conference carved up Africa into spheres of influence and set up the rules for claiming colonial possessions on the continent. The company's intent was to explore and exploit the mineral wealth of southern and central Africa, and thus it was given a royal charter granting it control over the territory that makes up much of modern-day Zimbabwe, but at the time would be called Southern Rhodesia, named for Cecil Rhodes. Now, like most colonies of the era, it was intended to be an extraction colony, exporting raw materials to the mother country and importing manufactured goods. But the company soon realized that Southern Rhodesia didn't have the same mineral wealth as South Africa. As this reality dawned on them, they had to change their business model. The company owned all the railroads in Southern Rhodesia, which were integrated with the rail networks of Northern Rhodesia and South Africa. But without mining, there was nothing for them to transport. The company would begin selling land into incoming settlers and encourage them to start up farms. These farms would produce agricultural products that would then need to be transported by rail to the ports of Cape Colony. Prior to this change in business strategy, there wasn't as much appropriation of land from the natives to the whites. The biggest defender of native rights in the colony, aside from the natives themselves, was the British government. The colony was being run by a royally chartered company, and after the charter was revoked, it was governed by a white settler population. The company and the settlers were the biggest exploiters of the local populace, and as time passed, the British government became more and more concerned over how much land was now in European hands rather than those of Africans. First in South Africa, and later in other colonies, they would set up native reserves, land that could not be bought by Europeans. This was done partly as a means to mitigate the possibility of revolts. It also provided places for blacks to live away from white settlements. The reserves were intended to be temporary, believing their necessity would dissipate over time as the Africans were integrated into the European money-based economy. But the imperial government would, from time to time, demand the company set aside land for native use. From this period onward, there would be an underlying hostility between the white settlers in Rhodesia and the British government, who was one of the few bodies looking out for the interests of the Africans. The reserve lands were communal holdings, but individual Africans were still allowed to buy lands outside of the reserves. However, this was easier said than done. Aside from the difficulties of procuring the necessary capital to buy the land and the expertise to navigate the legal process, those in charge of approving land sales had incentives of preserving land value. White settlers were less likely to buy land that was adjacent to those owned by blacks, which would cause all the surrounding property values to drop. This resulted in the land sale commissioners segregating the lands by race, only selling blacks land that was adjacent to other black landowners. However, the laws couldn't prevent individual European landowners from selling their land to Africans. The company didn't shift its business strategy to promoting agriculture until 1908, when the mining boom had died out, at which point they began eyeing up land in the native reserves. They began promoting immigration to Rhodesia throughout the British Empire. They set up a bank to provide loans to white settlers to pay for land and capital, while refusing to provide loans to African farmers until a separate bank was established for them in 1945. However, not everyone was on board with this attack on the native reserves. Not only was the British Colonial Office opposed to these policies, but white settlers were also suspicious of the company's intent. The whites already perceived the company as selling the land for extortionate prices, and despite their assault on the reserve lands, not much land in total was actually taken. What damage was done was mitigated by British imperial officials. In 1922, the royal charter giving the British South Africa Company the right to rule southern Rhodesia was revoked, at which point the white settlers were given two options: either become part of South Africa or become a colony with responsible government. And in a referendum later that year, The white Rhodesians chose the latter. They would establish their own parliament and elect their own prime minister. Anti-black policies had been in place for the entirety of company rule, but this was mostly done in service of company profits. When democracy was brought to white Rhodesians, they implemented such policies to maintain a racial and social hierarchy. The Black Peril was a common refrain within social discourse. But discourse isn't all bad, and being well read is a key to better discourse, which is why I am glad to be supported by this video's sponsor, Blinkist. Blinkist is an app that takes nonfiction books and boils them down to their essential points, turning them into 15-minute audiobooks. This makes it extremely easy to consume new books and get new ideas, which for me is really important. Since I'm making all of these long videos all the time, I don't really have time to read much stuff that's, not for a video. And so Blinkist lets me get the essential points from other books that aren't necessarily something I'm going to be making videos about, and I can apply them to my everyday life. Thankfully, Blinkist has over 5,000 titles in their catalog about science, happiness, productivity, and business. And those last two are of particular interest to me because I've been trying to turn this YouTube channel into a full-time job. I recently listened to their summaries of Content Inc. and how to take smart notes, which will be extremely useful for me in both researching videos as well as just running a content business. Memorial Day is coming up, and I decided to remind myself why it's important to remember our servicemen's sacrifices by listening to Q 1968 about how the Viet Cong captured this city during the Tet Offensive and how the US military reacted to it. Viewers of this channel can use my link down in the description below to get a 7-day free trial of Blinkist, as well as 50% off an annual premium subscription. But you gotta move quickly because this deal only lasts until May 29th. Thanks again to Blinkist for sponsoring this video, but for now, back to the history. When telling stories about the colonial period, there is this tendency to portray the native Africans as meekly accepting their fate, but this is far from the case. During the era of company rule, there had been numerous armed revolts, which led to the creation of the native reserves. In 1934, the African National Congress of Southern Rhodesia was founded. It was consisted mostly of Western-educated African elites. And although this group would not survive long itself, many of its members would go on to form the leadership of both the violent and non-violent resistance to white minority rule. But just because you had the advent of responsible government in Rhodesia did not mean violent resistance would go away. In 1933, a parliamentary election would bring Godfrey Huggins to power. Huggins was born in England in 1883 and emigrated to Rhodesia in 1911 in order to pursue a career as a doctor, which would lead to him serving in the Royal Army Medical Corps during the Great War. He would be elected to Parliament in 1924, and from there would have a meteoric rise to the top. Huggins chose a conservative cabinet. The members of his party were right-wing when it came to issues of race, but left-wing on economics. He introduced tariffs, subsidies, artificially low interest rates, and industrial control boards. They would nationalize numerous companies rather than seeing them go under. Godfrey Huggins would be popular amongst white Rhodesians, but unpopular amongst blacks because he is remembered as the father of Rhodesian apartheid. Huggins had campaigned on racial separation in 1933, but he quickly discovered that this was not feasible, and in later campaigns he would use the phrase parallel development. Africans constituted the labor force of both mining and agriculture, the two biggest industries, and the low wages of African workers made Rhodesian exports highly competitive on the international market. By the 1930s, Africans were also doing all the menial jobs in urban areas as well. Huggins allowed this because he wanted to avoid the creation of a white underclass which had caused political problems in South Africa. But the primary legal method for segregationist policies would be the Land Apportionment Act. The act had apportioned some of the land as being for white farmers and others being for blacks. However, there were a lot of black landowners in the white areas and vice versa, and they were all required to disinvest themselves of these lands by a deadline. However, every time this deadline came up, it had to be extended. The native problem had in no sense been solved. It is difficult to see how it could have been, and perhaps that well-used terminology is irrelevant in any case. Pre-war Rhodesia was not a country where rigid doctrines or long-term plans played much part. The whites were there because they liked the climate, hoped to make money, enjoyed a way of life that was a pleasant mixture of English and un-English. The blacks were there because they were there. Despite the inability to create physical separation between the races, the South Rhodesian government would minimize African political influence. Huggins tried to get the British to approve a law outright banning Africans from voting, but the Colonial Office refused to allow this. Instead, they would reduce the black vote by implementing additional requirements, such as land ownership and literacy tests. Huggins borrowed ideas from South Africa, such as the Industrial Conciliation Act. This act required urban employers to pay black and white workers equally. Now, on the surface, this might sound like a good thing. But with no economic incentive to hire blacks over whites, and white workers generally being better educated and racially preferred, there was no reason to hire blacks. And you can tell this was meant to protect white workers and keep blacks out of skilled labor jobs because the law only applied to urban centers where most of the white population lived. The Native Councils Act was passed in 1937, which allowed chiefs and elected leaders amongst the Africans to form their own local councils. This served the double duty of helping govern rural areas that were out of reach from the white urban areas, as well as provide employment opportunities to educated Africans so they wouldn't have to seek work in the cities. However, this policy was seen as too liberal by some in the Rhodesian government, and so most of the powers were taken away in 1943. The economy was dependent on exports of minerals and cash crops, but unlike other colonies, the whites living and working in Rhodesia were heavily invested in the economy. Unlike other African colonies, which saw a rotating class of professionals temporarily move in and then move out, the whites that moved to Rhodesia tended to stay. Huggins tried to get more whites to emigrate to Rhodesia by offering to either pay debts of farmers or push a moratorium on debt payments. He also wanted to keep whites living in rural areas, which made it easier to extend central authorities outside the cities. The economies of northern Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, and South Africa were interconnected, especially the mines, farms, railroads, and ports. And the Ottawa Conference of 1932 created the Imperial Preference System in the British Empire, which gave preferential trading status to goods trading within the empire. As demands for decolonization swept across the world after World War II, there were experiments in maintaining some amount of European control over independent colonies. In South Central Africa, a union of several British colonies was first proposed by Godfrey Huggins in 1935. A merger of North and South Rhodesia into a single state, unifying them both politically and economically. But there was opposition to it. Whites in Rhodesia opposed it because they feared it would upset the racial balance, which in the South was already lopsided toward blacks. But in the North it was even more so. They feared that merging the two together would make white minority rule numerically impossible. However, in the North, the Union was opposed by blacks because they feared the more politically adept and economically developed South would impose their racial policies onto the North. The idea would be resurrected by Clement Attlee's government and brought to fruition after Churchill and the Conservatives took power in 1950.
I must share in a collective responsibility. Had I then realised, or had indeed any of us realised, the almost revolutionary way in which the situation would develop and the rapid growth of African nationalism throughout the whole African continent, I think I should have opposed the putting together of three countries so opposite in their characters and so different in their history.
In 1953, the Federation would be formed, consisting of Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland, with its capital located in Salisbury. A new central government would be created to handle defense and economic policy, with domestic and social affairs being left to the constituent parts. In 1953, Godfrey Huggins formed the United Federal Party to support the creation of the new federation. Northern Rhodesia's leaders were Roy Walensky and Doughty Yamba. Nyasaland's leaders were Malcolm Barrow and Orton Chirwa. Huggins would become prime minister, but he would retire in 1956 and would be succeeded by Walensky. And back in southern Rhodesia, Garfield Todd would succeed Huggins as prime minister. Todd had immigrated to southern Rhodesia from New Zealand in 1934 as a missionary, running a primary school where a young Robert Mugabe would work as a teacher. He also ran a medical clinic that primarily serviced the African population. He would eventually get elected to Parliament in 1948. Now, Todd was something of an anomaly in South Rhodesian politics in that he actively encouraged the bettering of the living conditions and civil rights of Black Rhodesians. With voting rights restricted in part by literacy tests, he tried to reform the educational system, doubling the number of primary schools serving Africans, as well as providing government grants to missionary-run schools, which provided most of the secondary and post-secondary education for blacks in southern Rhodesia. As demands for independence grew from other colonies, demands for civil and political rights began to grow in southern Rhodesia. Following the examples of civil rights activists in the US, activists in southern Rhodesia orchestrated a boycott of public transit in urban areas after a fee increase, which disproportionately impacted blacks who commuted into the city for work. This brought remnants of the old Southern Rhodesian ANC back into activism. Joshua Nkomo would found a new organization, recycling the old name, and becoming its chairman in 1957. Nkomo was born in 1917 to a family of the Ndel ethnic group. Throughout his youth, he worked numerous jobs, such as carpentry, ranching, driving, and teaching. While attending university in South Africa, he would meet a young Nelson Mandela. Upon returning to Rhodesia, he would begin a career of labor activism. He even ran for a seat in parliament in 1953, but, unsurprisingly, was beaten. Well, the Southern Rhodesian ANC would ally with Garfield Todd. He pushed reforms that increased black suffrage from 2% to 16%. But these reforms would spell the end of Todd's premiership. They were considered out of step with public opinion, and that they would play into the hands of extremist black politicians. Todd's plan would cause his cabinet to resign en masse, which resulted in the United Federal Party removing him from power. And during his farewell address, Todd would say this to the Rhodesian Parliament.
"We must make it possible for every individual to lead the good life, to win a place in the sun. We are in danger of becoming a race of fear-ridden neurotics. We who live in the finest country on earth."
Todd would be replaced by Sir Edgar Whitehead, who would call for an election in June 1958, which resulted in the UFP winning 17 of the 30 seats. At this time, the Federation began to lose steam as Africans in northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland began to obtain more political power within their regions. Some of these leaders would be accused of fomenting riots and civil unrest, which the whites branded as terrorism.
Terrorists are adept at using the freedom inherent in our philosophy and constitution in order to subvert freedom. Where the majority of the adult population is still illiterate and does not understand a Western democratic system that is foreign to it, the ground is fertile for terrorists. The more primitive and simple the society you are dealing with, the greater the need for positive and swift action.
In 1959, Whitehead's government would ban the ANC for its involvement in riots the year prior, and they would arrest hundreds of their members and leaders. Nkomo and the other remaining leaders from the ANC would meet up to establish the National Democratic Party in January of 1960, with Nkomo elected as the party president. The NDP would be an explicitly socialist and African nationalist party. As early as 1960, the NDP had established contacts with the Soviet Union and began discussing sending members to the Eastern Bloc to receive military training. The calls for decolonization were growing, and even the conservative government of Harold Macmillan couldn't resist the demands for independence and majority rule in the colonies. While on a tour of Africa, he would give a speech that would elucidate the new colonial policy of the British government.
The wind of change is blowing through this continent, whether we like it or not. Their growth of national consciousness is a political fact.
But many in Rhodesia believed that they had the right to absolute control, regardless of their small numbers. They were also terrified of the anti-white pogroms that had taken place elsewhere in Africa after independence, especially the ongoing events in the Belgian Congo. White refugees fled to Rhodesia, and their horror stories stoked the fears of white Rhodesians. As fears of growing unrest spread, a conference on the future of the Federation was held in Salisbury in 1960. But after a single day of discussions, the African leaders walked out.
How could a compromise be agreed between Africans demanding a majority on the Legislative Council, both in northern and southern Rhodesia, while the Europeans refused even to consider parity in the former and proper African representation in the latter?
Whitehead, initially supportive of the British presence, was now trying to weaken the British position in Rhodesia as the Federation began to fall apart. White Africans were, overall, supportive of the Federation, but blacks were overwhelmingly opposed. A conference in southern Rhodesia would draft a new constitution in 1961. Whitehead was hoping that a new constitution that gave greater representation to blacks would assuage any fears the British had over white minority rule, and would convince them to grant southern Rhodesia independence. It would expand the parliament from 30 seats to 65. 50 of these seats were referred to as A-roll seats, and 15 of them were referred to as B-roll seats. The B-roll seats were reserved for non-white representatives, categorized as African, colored, and Asian seats. The A-roll seats were not explicitly reserved for white candidates, but black votes were weighted to have far less power in those elections, and thus functionally were. Under the old constitution, blacks had basically no representation in parliament at all. Under this new system, they would have at least 12 of the 15 B-roll seats allotted to them. However, due to the way black votes were weighted among the A-roll seats, that also basically functioned as a ceiling of representation as well. And it was basically mathematically impossible for them to achieve black majority rule. That same year, Whitehead began pushing for Southern Rhodesia to secede from the Federation. When meeting with Harold Macmillan, he demands that the British abrogate its reserve powers over Rhodesia. Macmillan would push Whitehead to have a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, as well as the creation of a second chamber of Parliament that was at least half African that could stall or kill legislation. The Privy Council would require the former of these suggestions before they approved the new Constitution. Macmillan would also meet with black Rhodesian politicians on his trip to Salisbury, who had different demands of the British government.
These were chiefly interested in asking the British government not to give up the reserved rights over legislation affecting Africans. Without this, they had no confidence that the Europeans in Rhodesia would behave fairly toward them.
A referendum would be held on the new constitution. The NDP didn't participate in the official vote, but instead held their own referendum that overwhelmingly voted no. The UFP and Whitehead campaigned, saying, "Vote no for Nkomo," implying that not approving the Constitution would lead to black majority rule. The yes vote won overwhelmingly. The Constitution had to be approved by the British Parliament, who wouldn't approve it unless a section was added that allowed the UK to intervene by order in council. But during the referendum, Whitehead, Walensky, and the colonial governor assured voters that the new Constitution represents independence for Southern Rhodesia in the event of the Federation being dissolved. British sources, however, reject this claim. The whites living in northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland were desperate to keep the Federation alive, believing that its dissolution would result in independent black governments, at best confiscating white wealth and property, and at worst, actively abetting anti-white pogroms. Macmillan believed that completely giving in to African demands would cause Walensky and the Federation government to declare independence, and he feared that this would spark a race war in Central Africa. On the other hand, if the British didn't agree to enough of the African demands, they could face widespread unrest, and have the Federation face the same problems as the Congo. After riots and violence involving the NDP in the summer, they would be banned in December of 1961. Nkomo would go on to form the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, a militant communist party. Joshua Nkomo was president, Onungi Sithole was made chairman, and Robert Mugabe was in charge of propaganda. They also announced the creation of its military wing, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, in 1962. Its strategy was focused on building a conventional standing army that could militarily defeat the whites in battle, replicating the Viet Minh's success at Bien Dien Phu. In July 1962, Nkomo visited Moscow and discussed plans for a ZAPU-led uprising. He requested Soviet funding, arms, and training, saying,
For these purposes, ZAPU needs arms, explosives, and revolvers. The party also needs money to bribe persons who guard important installations, to carry out sabotage.
ZAPU had its own factional split in 1962 and 63. The Zimbabwe African National Union was formed by those who dissented from Nkomo's leadership. It was left-wing and Pan-Africanist, demanding the creation of a one-party state and the abolition of private property. While ZAPU built up ties with the Soviets, ZANU would reach out to China, and they would be led by Sithole and Mugabe. Sithole was born in 1920. He studied in the US in the 1950s and was ordained a Methodist minister. And he would go on to publish a book titled African Nationalism, which would be banned by the Rhodesian government. Robert Mugabe was born at Kutama Mission in southern Rhodesia and received his early education from Jesuit missionaries. He became a school teacher but would go to South Africa for higher education, where he would join the ANC Youth League. There he was exposed to the ideas of African nationalism and communism. He received a BA in History and English Literature and would return to Rhodesia in 1952. He would take a number of teaching jobs until he moved to Ghana to work at a training college. He returned to Rhodesia in 1960, where he got involved in protests over the arrests of NDP members, and subsequently joining the group, and would follow them through numerous bans until co-founding ZANU. ZANU would go on to form a paramilitary wing, the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, or ZANLA, which would send members to receive military training in China. But the political landscape of southern Rhodesia began to change between 1961 and 1962. Edgar Whitehead began reaching out to black Rhodesians for political support. He passed legislation getting rid of redundant racial discrimination and also encouraged blacks to participate in electoral politics, in spite of black nationalists calling on them to boycott elections. Whitehead began his Build a Nation campaign, in which both white and black Rhodesians would work together to make South Rhodesia a better place for all. This change in tune from Whitehead led many in the United Federal Party to abandon him and join the newly formed Rhodesian Front Party. The Rhodesian Front Party was a product of two MPs from the Federation Parliament, Winston Field, the leader of the Liberal Dominion Party, and Ian Smith of the UFP. The party's membership consisted of younger white Rhodesians who identified as Rhodesians more so than as British. They advocated for secession from the Federation and independence within the Commonwealth of Nations. They supported continued white minority rule and were ardently anti-communist. Ian Smith attributes the Rhodesian Party's success to
a political awareness had suddenly gripped Rhodesians, as there was a general feeling that the hour had come, and that if they did not arouse themselves, they were going to lose their country altogether.
Elections in 1962 would see the Rhodesian Front win 35 of the 50 A-roll seats.
The election in South Rhodesia is, on the face of it, a retrograde and reactionary vote. The real danger is increased. The white man will be driven to extremism everywhere in Africa in order to fight African extremism.
The Rhodesian Front would elect Winston Field to be its leader, who would subsequently become Prime Minister. Field was born in England in 1904 and moved to southern Rhodesia in 1921, where he would become a tobacco farmer and serve as the president of the Rhodesian Tobacco Association. Like many white Rhodesians of his age, he would serve in the military during the Second World War. He achieved the rank of major in the British forces and took part in the D-Day invasions. He would be elected to the federal parliament in 1957 as part of the Dominion Party. But in 1962, he was recruited by Ian Smith to lead the Rhodesian Front, hoping to use Field's reputation as a moderate to assuage detractors from the party's racialist rhetoric. Ian Smith was born in Rhodesia in 1919. Like Field, he also served in World War II, serving in the Royal Air Force. He was shot down over northern Italy in 1944 and fought with Italian partisans for a time until he could be reunited with British forces. He returned to Rhodesia after the war and would be elected to the South Rhodesian Parliament in 1948. Field would appoint Smith as the Deputy Prime Minister in 1962. On December 19th, the British government announced that Nyasaland would have permission to secede from the Federation. And on March 29, 1963, they announced the same for North Rhodesia. The Federation Parliament would criticize the British government for allowing the dismemberment of the Federation. However, the British government would emphasize that it was the constituent parts of the Federation that wanted the Federation dissolved. With the Federation on the precipice of collapse, the British wanted to peacefully and orderly dissolve it. In the discussions between the Federation government and Britain, Macmillan said they needed to discuss the franchise in southern Rhodesia, as well as the Land Apportionment Act, before they could be approved for independence. The South Rhodesian government reported that the UK government had already accepted their most recent constitution as having been sufficient for approving independence, which the British denied. Field would meet with Macmillan in May of 1963, but to no avail. When the dissolution conference was being proposed, Winston Field tried to condition his involvement and cooperation on South Rhodesia receiving independence. In 1963, the British Foreign Minister, Sir Alec Douglas Home, drew up a list of 5 criteria, which would become preconditions for any colony to gain independence. Policies that would result in majority rule, an end to future legislation that was detrimental to native interests, improved political status for natives, an official end to racial discrimination, and a political settlement that was acceptable to the whole population. After an exchange of messages, Field began to back down from his demand for immediate independence and changed it to a demand for independence upon formal dissolution of the Federation. But Butler began to pressure Field into laying out a plan for liberalizing the Rhodesian government.
I was conscious of a division of opinion throughout the party on this grave issue. There were some who felt that it was unrealistic to refuse an independence which we could not in fact prevent. There were others who were deeply concerned about the future of the African population, and felt that even if we were powerless, we ought not in honour to grant independence without effective safeguards for African progress.
Upon returning to Rhodesia, Field advised the cabinet that they should participate in the dissolution conference, because refusing to do so would not win them any friends in the British government. Additionally, the assets of the Federation were going to be distributed among the constituent members, and if Southern Rhodesia boycotted the conference, they would get nothing. In a private conversation, Field allegedly said to Smith,
"We must keep our feet on the ground and realize that if the British government really made up their mind, they could crush us as easily as a big boot can crush a beetle."
The dissolution conference would be held in Victoria Falls along the border between North and South Rhodesia. Before the conference, Field and Smith meet with UK Foreign Secretary Richard Austin Butler, who, according to Smith's account, approved South Rhodesia's demand of being granted independence no later than North Rhodesia and Nyasaland. In exchange, he wanted the South Rhodesians to help him at the conference. When Smith asked for a written agreement to be signed, Butler is alleged to have said that signing such an agreement would be distasteful and would be a public display of distrust between Salisbury and London. The Victoria Falls Conference was held between June 28th and July 2nd, 1963, and the Federation would be dissolved by the end of that year.
The rest of the sad story as regards Southern Rhodesia is well known. It is easy to see the errors which were made by the European leaders in Africa. It is equally proper to admit the faults of which we at home were no doubt guilty. The immense amount of time and trouble taken over the future of the African territories amid so many other baffling problems, internal and external, which we, like every other government, had to contend. If, as mortals, we could not command success, we might almost claim to have deserved it.
The conference would see the federal armed forces and its equipment given to Southern Rhodesia. They would also inherit the financial liabilities of the Federation. Smith wanted to push for more independence, but Field told him to hold off. He had heard through the grapevine that Macmillan was planning on retiring, and that his most likely successor would be Alec Home, whom they believed would be more conducive to their cause. Home became Prime Minister in October of 1963, at which point Smith visited London to talk with the UK government about financial assistance. He would meet with Home, and according to Smith, they were friendly. Upon Smith's return to Salisbury, the cabinet sent a message to London asking for clarification on the independence issue. In response, Field was invited to a meeting in London with representatives of Australia, Canada, and Tanzania to solve the Rhodesia crisis. But the cabinet rejected the invitation, seeing it as a delaying tactic in order to help the Conservatives win the upcoming general elections.
Although the Conservatives were traditionally our friends, it was plain that the dominating issue before them was their impending general election, and that the Rhodesian issues to be relegated to the background until that had taken place.
Smith and Field had different strategies in mind on how to negotiate with the British. Smith wanted an aggressive strategy that called for making demands and ultimatums, whereas Field was a bit more patient. His idea was, how about we just let the situation in all the colonies to the north of us continue to deteriorate, and do that to the point till where the British see our point of view and just concede our demands. Field made one last visit to London in January of 1964 to speak with Home, who allegedly told Field that if the Conservatives won their upcoming election, they would grant Rhodesia's request for independence. But there were two problems. Home wasn't willing to put this promise in writing, and everyone was under the assumption that the Conservatives were going to lose the election. Within the Rhodesian government, talks of declaring independence unilaterally were growing. Lawyers and professors started publishing papers on legal and constitutional justifications for such action. A vote on removing the British right to intervene in internal affairs was brought up in Parliament, but the Privy Council in London rejected it. Many in the party felt that Field wasn't fighting hard enough for Rhodesian independence. Growing discontent in the cabinet led Field to ask one MP, John Gaunt, to resign, who asked to stall his resignation till Monday in order to settle some matters in his office. But over the weekend, Gaunt met with Ian Smith and plotted Field's downfall. The Rhodesian Front caucus met on April 2nd, 1964, and voted to remove Field, which was announced on April 3rd. Ian Smith would replace Fields as Prime Minister on April 14th. One of his first actions was to send a message to the British government, asking to clarify why they would not grant Rhodesia independence. The British responded with a question of their own. Can you give blacks more representation in Parliament? Smith complained that they had just given blacks more representation 2 years earlier. Some in the party advocated that they declare independence then and there, believing the Conservatives in London would be more likely to accept it as a fait accompli. Smith's government began a campaign of reaching out to foreign countries to obtain their support, visiting India, Pakistan, and Europe on their way to the UK. Included in their delegation were members of the Chiefs Council, who were denied a meeting with Alec Home.
It was an impressive affair conducted with efficiency and dignity. This gave the lie to the story which was being propagated by the black nationalist politicians and their Marxist-Leninist collaborators that the chiefs were stooges of the government and retained their position at the convenience of the government.
Most governments abroad saw Smith's use of the Council of Chiefs as a political shield to protect themselves from accusations of racism and apartheid. And while the white Rhodesians were fighting a political fight for independence, the Africans in southern Rhodesia would be preparing for an armed struggle. ZIPRA fighters would receive military training in the Soviet Union beginning in early 1964, and Nkomo's endorsement of violence confirmed white Rhodesians' fears about decolonization. The Rhodesian government responded to the formation of ZIPRA by banning ZAPU, driving them underground. They also enacted draconian security laws, restricting the right to assembly and granting security forces broad powers to crack down on suspected political subversives. They also introduced the death penalty for acts of politically inspired terrorism. On July 4, 1964, ZANU insurgents murdered Peter Johann Andries Oberholzer, the white foreman of the Silver Streams Wattles Company. Smith's government would arrest ZANU and ZAPU leaders in August of 1964. The remaining ZANU leaders, Josiah Tongogara and Herbert Chitepo, would operate out of bases in Zambia. Smith made another diplomatic push in September of 1964. En route to London, he visits Antonio Salazar in Portugal.
Salazar was one of the most remarkable men I had met. He was referred to as a dictator of Portugal, but this had no bearing on the truth. He was a quiet, retiring intellectual university professor who committed to paper his philosophy for solving political problems of his country.
Salazar was angry at Britain for not supporting him against anti-colonial rebellions in his African colonies, as well as not supporting Portugal during India's annexation of Goa. Smith would set up a trade office in Lisbon in order to arrange economic relations with Portugal, and in the event that sanctions are placed on Rhodesia, the Portuguese colony of Mozambique bordered Rhodesia to its east, and would provide a lifeline to international trade. He talked with Salazar about communist plans for world domination and Soviet encroachment into Africa. Salazar asked if he was planning to declare independence, and Smith said if Britain didn't keep its promise, he would. Smith meets Home on September 7th. Smith's memoirs claim Home was supportive, but that his actions were constrained by the politics of the Commonwealth. Smith laid out his proposal for a referendum and explained the Councils of Chiefs system in hopes of allaying their concerns over black representation. Smith claims the ministers of Home's government were supportive of the plan, but that the Commonwealth and the UN weren't. The British government asked how the referendum could be made to include a wider range of people. Smith tried to justify the lack of participation by blacks in politics by pointing to the high rates of illiteracy, as well as a preference for their tribal forms of government, as well as pointing to black nationalists constantly encouraging boycotts of elections. Additionally, he argued that widening the franchise would only empower black extremist politicians. Home ended up telling Smith that they couldn't make such a controversial decision this close to an election, and that if they won the upcoming election, they would come to an agreement before the next Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference. Alec Home would have this to say of Smith. He is a simple-minded, politically naive, and uncomprehending character. His political approach has been described as schoolboy. He possesses a strong vein of schoolboy obstinacy, and there is a mixture of schoolboy stubbornness, cunning, and imperception about his speeches. Likewise, there is a boy's own paper ring about his patriotic utterances. Nevertheless, his pedestrian and humorless manner often conceals a shrewder assessment of a particular situation than it first appears on the surface, and he should not be underrated. Upon return to southern Rhodesia, Smith ordered an Indaba to be convened to vote on independence. He sent a message to London asking them to send observers, but Home told him that this system was not what they had in mind when they asked him to get the consent of black Rhodesians. Harold Wilson and Labour took power after the 1964 general election, and they took an even harder line on Rhodesia, mandating that these issues must be addressed before a timetable for independence could be set. Harold Wilson's government was committed to black majority rule, while the Rhodesian Front was committed to white minority rule. Smith accused Wilson's government of being hell-bent on appeasing the cult of Marxist-Leninism. Arthur Bottomley became the Minister of Overseas Development and declined to send observers to Rhodesia for the Indaba, but offered to visit Smith while on a visit to Zambia. He also wanted to speak with Nkomo and Sethole, but they were in prison, and Smith refused to allow Bottomley to visit them. On October 23, 1964, Prime Minister Wilson invited Smith to visit London to talk, but Smith refused this visit as well, this time claiming it was because of government business, such as the referendum. Wilson replied to the refusal by threatening to make a public statement condemning any move toward unilateral independence. Wilson portrays the 1961 government as a product of the Rhodesians and called the Council of Chiefs paid creatures of the government. On November 5, 1964, a referendum on independence was held in Rhodesia, with only 15% of the voting population being black. The referendum resulted in over 90% of the votes supporting unilateral independence. Ian Smith took this referendum, along with support from Salazar, and tried to negotiate away Holmes's 5 principles for independence. Smith would visit London to attend Winston Churchill's funeral on January 30th, 1965. Wilson and Smith would meet, and they agreed on a visit from Bottomley and Lord Chancellor Gardiner to Rhodesia in order to discuss the issue with Smith's government. But there's a dispute in the record over whether or not Smith would even allow Bottomley and Gardiner to visit the imprisoned African political leaders. Smith's memoir claims that this was a prerequisite for them being able to visit, is that they could not see the imprisoned African political leaders, whereas Harold Wilson's memoir doesn't mention this as an issue at all. They would arrive on February 22, 1965, and meet with the Council of Chiefs, trade unions, and black nationalists. Wilson would send a message to Smith in March and said that his government could not accept independence for Rhodesia under the 1961 Constitution. During the negotiations in Salisbury in March 1965, the British proposed amending the Constitution, raising the threshold to amending the Constitution to 2/3 vote in Parliament, so long as over 1/3 of the members of Parliament were non-white, or whites elected by Africans. Smith, although hesitant in accepting this proposal, was open to some ratio of non-white members of Parliament being able to prevent legislation or constitutional amendments. Smith would call for an early election in order to increase his parliamentary majority to 2/3, so they could pass constitutional amendments. The election was held on May 7th, and the Rhodesian Front won all 50 of the A-roll seats. Smith visited London in October 1965. Smith gave his proposal for an upper house to Parliament that could block legislation, and that half would be black. But because these seats were given to the tribal chiefs, the British government saw them as insufficient. Under the current constitution, it was estimated that it would be at least 15 years before majority rule was achieved, and more likely 50. Wilson offered financial assistance to speed up the education process for the Africans, to which Smith responded,
"The Rhodesian government would think it wrong to accelerate the educational advance of the Africans simply in order to improve their political status in the community."
Wilson asked the Rhodesian Parliament to repeal the Land Apportionment Act. Smith portrays the act as protecting tribal lands from white encroachment. Smith warned Wilson that the British were forcing his government into a position where they would have to act on their own. On October 8, 1965, the negotiations broke down, and Smith issued a statement.
"We've done our utmost to meet the British government on their 5 principles, and in the process put forward many constructive suggestions which, if accepted, would have established a basis for independence that would have been fair to all parties concerned. The fact of the matter is that the Rhodesian ministers suggested new proposals to help meet the British point of view, so the latter's demands increased, in the end rendering it impossible for the opposing views to be reconciled."
On October 11th, Smith met with leaders of the conservative opposition, who submitted a proposal to Wilson, a treaty agreeing to the political rights of Rhodesia and of black Rhodesians, and that there would be no regression on either. There would be an increased effort to provide education to black Rhodesians so that more of them could pass the literacy tests in order to vote. The Privy Council would be made as the final court of appeal on all their disputes. Wilson and Smith would meet that same day, to which Smith said the terms of the proposed treaty were acceptable. However, the UN had called on Wilson's government to use all means at their disposal to prevent Rhodesian independence. Wilson would visit Rhodesia on October 25, 1965. He would meet with the imprisoned opposition leaders, who made it clear that he and ZANU would never accept independence under the 1961 Constitution. Smith would blame British voters for him pursuing the Unilateral Declaration of Independence.
Once again, we were in an impossible position. The British electorate had decided to change their government for reasons affecting themselves and their lives. Not one of the voters would have been influenced by Rhodesia. But had they voted Conservative, the Rhodesian problem would have been solved. Because they voted Labour, there would be no solution. Clearly, we could not continue in this invidious position.
Harold Wilson declared such an action would be an act of treason, but he refused to use armed force to stop it. Talks broke down, and so on November 11th, 1965, the Rhodesian cabinet issued a Unilateral Declaration of Independence, which was denounced as an act of rebellion against the Crown. Rhodesia had intended to remain loyal to the Crown by recognizing Queen Elizabeth II as the Queen of Rhodesia. Smith announced the declaration over radio. It intentionally echoed America's Declaration of Independence from 1776.
Whereas, in the course of human affairs, history has shown that it may become necessary for a people to resolve the political affiliations which have connected them with another people, and to assume amongst other nations the separate and equal status to which they are entitled.
It does not explicitly mention racial motivations, but they are implied.
That the people of Rhodesia have witnessed a process which is destructive to those very precepts upon which civilization in a primitive country has been built. They have seen the principles of Western democracy, responsible government, and moral standards crumble elsewhere. Nevertheless, they have remained steadfast.
And they would try to stay in the good graces of the British government.
In humble submission to Almighty God, who controls the destinies of nations, conscious that the people of Rhodesia have always shown unswerving loyalty and devotion to Her Majesty the Queen, and earnestly praying that we and the people of Rhodesia will not be hindered in our determination to continue exercising our undoubted right to demonstrate the same loyalty and devotion, and seeking to promote the common good so that all dignity and freedom of all men may be assured.
Thanks again to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. Make sure you check out the top link in the description to start a 7-day free trial. I would also like to thank my patrons for making this video possible. In particular, I would like to thank my newest patrons, Saman, Justin, Max, and Butter. Their support allows me to take on riskier subjects like this. If you're interested in supporting this channel as well, check out patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. If this topic interests you, then I suggest watching my previous video about the Congo crisis, or perhaps you should check out my video about Muammar Gaddafi's international terror network. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.